Hey everybody, this is the fourth here, and in this video I'm going to be introducing you to the Wave Candy plugin that comes with FL Studio. Throughout this tutorial you're going to see me using Wave Candy quite a bit, so I did just want to make a video about it to help give you guys a better idea of how exactly it works. And it is a pretty great plugin if you want to kind of get a visual representation of your sound in a few different ways. Now, in this video, I'm not going to go into too much depth about how each setting works because that is something I cover in more detail in other videos throughout this tutorial series. So in this video, I will tell you that the Wave Candy can be, a spectrum, a Vectorscope, and Oscilloscope, and I won't really cover how those different tools work because I do cover that in different videos in this section of the tutorial. When you add a Wave Candy to a mixer track, by default it will look like this, and it will be set to the Oscilloscope setting. And I can click on and drag the sides and the corners to resize it if I want it to be a little bit bigger. And by dragging it to resize and reshape it, I can change the mode that it is in. So if I make it a tall, skinny rectangle, it will be a level meter. And then if I drag that out a little bit more, it will be a spectrum. And if I make it a square, it will be a Vectorscope. And then if I make it a more horizontal rectangular shape as it was before, it will be back to the oscilloscope. And then if you look at the Wave Candy panel, you can also change between these modes by clicking the little tabs down here. Now, on this panel, you have quite a few different options, and I'm not going to cover everything. If you want a really detailed explanation of all the different parameters, you can definitely check out the manual. I'll be covering the most important ones in this video, and I'm going to kind of skip over the more aesthetic settings, just because I think the aesthetics are a little bit less important than the actual functionality of it. So the Wave Candy panel is split into a few different sections. And the first one is your input section. And the input gain will either increase or decrease the observed level of your input. It doesn't actually change the level that is coming out of the plugin. All it does is change how you see it. And that will work for each of the different modes. And then you also have this hold button here. And so, if you want to freeze the image at any point to really get a better look at what is happening in the audio, you can click that and it will just freeze that image right when you click it. So that can really be helpful if you want a better look at what is happening over a certain period of time during the sound. And then next to the input section, you have the appearance section. And a lot of this is just kind of aesthetic, so I won't really be covering it, but there are a few bits that are pretty useful to know about. And the first one is visible. And if you turn that off, it'll just, the display of that wave candy will be gone. And if you turn it back on, it's back. But there's also the mini view, which turns it into a, small version of the display. And so you can turn that mini view on or off by doing it in the appearance section, or you can just double click on the wave candy itself. And so that's kind of nice. If you want to have a few different wave candy plugins on the master, just while you're working, you could do that and, have them minimized most of the time like this. And then bring up whichever ones you wanted to. So that's pretty cool, and you can just kind of use them as an extra toolbar. And then below the mini view, you have background and solid. And you can see right now both of them are on, and I can click on the wave candy and move it around and all that stuff. But if I turn off solid, I won't be able to click on it, and I can actually work through it. So that's pretty nice if you want to kind of have it up there most of the time and have it not really be in the way. And this is something, if you've watched my other videos, you'll see all the time I have a spectrum over here. And I've actually done more than that. I've turned the background off. And turning the background off automatically turns solid off. So you can, work behind it and all that. And so, it's a really nice way for you to visualize what's happening and, save screen space if you're kind of only have one monitor or have limited screen space. So those are the most useful bits in the appearance section. And then the colors section is pretty much entirely aesthetic. It can be useful in some situations, but there's quite a bit to it, so I'm not really going to go into depth on that. The main thing is, by default, if you want it to be a little bit less transparent, the background, you can just turn this CA knob, which is the color opacity, and it will, give you a better view of what's happening. If you need a better view. So those are all the main sections. And then you also have various options for the different modes that you can use. So we'll start off looking at the oscilloscope. So I'm going to start from the right to the left. And on the right, you have the stereo separation knob. And what this does is, if you look by default, it will show you one waveform, which is the summation of your left and right channels. But if you turn that on a little bit, you'll start to get two different waveforms. And if you have it all the way up, they will be completely separated, so you can view them independently and get a really good view of them each on their own. But if you kind of want them to be overlaid a little bit, so you can see how they relate to each other, you can turn that down and you'll see them overlaid. So that can just help you get a better idea of what's going on in your stereo waveforms. And now update and window are kind of related, and they basically allow you to zoom in on the waveform in different ways. So you can just watch as I play with those, the view on the waveform will change. So if you turn them both all the way up, it will give you a more zoomed out view. And if you turn them both more down, they will zoom in a lot more. And the cool thing about the update knob is you can right click it to select different note values. So if you want to observe a waveform, like a single cycle waveform, and see how certain effects change that, you can, select one of these note values and play that waveform on that note and just get a good idea of what is happening to that waveform. So you can see for this saw wave, if I wanted to kind of freeze that saw wave in the image, I can play it on the note of C and then select one of the C settings for the update. And then, I can see exactly what different effects and stuff do to that waveform a lot more clearly. And then finally, you have the pinch and interpolate settings. So the pinch option, if you look at the waveform, you can see that the saw wave kind of gets, squeezed back to 0 around this point. And if I turn that off, it doesn't do that. So that's what the pinch does. And interpolate just kind of smooths up the view of that waveform. If you look at this waveform without the interpolate on, and I, zoom in all the way, you can see, it sounds like a pure sine wave, but it looks really kind of blocky and chunky. And that's just because of the sample rate. And, that's what interpolation does. It kind of smooths up that chunkiness of the waveform. And you can see if I turn the interpolation on, it looks like how it sounds. And, that's all I'm really going to say about interpolation here. But you can look it up and look into it if you want. Yeah, it's kind of important. It's not super important, but it might be worth knowing about. But you can see that just regarding this oscilloscope, it, smooths up the sine wave and makes it look like an actual sine wave. And, interpolation is happening when you're working in the digital audio workstation and when you export and all that. Okay, now let's look at the different options you have for the spectrum. And again, you have an update knob. And, if you turn that to lower values, it kind of moves through this screen faster. It updates more quickly. Compared to if you have higher values. And then you also have the scale knob, and this will just adjust the weighting of the different frequency values. So you can see right now you have the balance is kind of more even. Every 5,000 hertz is about the same amount of space on this. But I can adjust that so that it's more based on octaves. So you can see that each octave is about the same space. And I can have that anywhere between these values. I personally really like to have the scale all the way up because it gives me a nice clear view of kind of the lower frequencies, the mid-range and the bass and all that. If I play this section of the song, you can kind of see the snare, the bass and all that. Whereas if the scale is more down, so much of the sound is happening all the way down here. So I like to have the scale all the way up. And then you can see it's kind of blurry. And you can change that. You can have less bands if you want to. Or I like to have it at the maximum number of bands. And you can see that it just gives you a really nice view of the snare drum is here, the kick is here, the bass is down here, and all the other sounds are, happening around that. And then you also have this dB range knob, which is the decibel range. And that just changes kind of how it shows the colors on this graph. So you can see that the louder sounds are more yellow, they're more bright, and then the less loud sounds are more blue. And you can change that if you turn it up. It kind of shows everything as being louder. Or you can turn that down. And then finally you have the natural weighting option, and it's on by default. And what this does is, people hear different frequencies as being different levels of loudness, even if the actual frequency is played at the same amplitude. And so natural weighting aims to display that on the spectrum. So the way we perceive sound is we are much more sensitive to higher frequencies than to kind of the lower frequencies. And then if you get too low, we start to be much less sensitive to that. And you'll see when I play this song, you can see the different colors, and you can see that the high end is pretty red still. The kick is fairly bright yellow, and the bass is pretty orange as well. But if I turn off that natural weighting, things are going to look a little bit differently. So you can see that the bass has gotten much more present, and the high end has gotten a little bit less compared to how it was with that natural weighting on. And that's just because we don't really hear this bass, especially the lower bass, as loudly as we would hear the same amplitude values up in the higher ranges. So the natural weighting just tries to display the information on the spectrum more closely to how we would perceive it. Now let's look at the settings on the meter. So, this is just your typical level meter. And you can adjust the scale. So, you can kind of have a better view of the higher decibel ranges, or you can zoom out quite a bit and see more clearly across a broader range of decibel values. So, that can be useful depending on what you need to monitor and how you need to monitor it. And then next to the scale knob, you have the hold time. And the hold time just this peak hold right here. If you turn this up, that will stay around longer. And if you turn it down, it will stay around less long. And if you turn that down all the way, there won't even be a peak hold. And then you also have a decay speed, and that just determines how quickly the bars that indicate your level will decay. So depending on your preferences, you can change that if you want to. And then you also have a mode option. So by default, it's on peak, which is just a peak meter. And then you also have a few different options for how you can meter that level. You have a ppm meter. You have an RMS meter. And then you have a few other options as well. I'm not really going to go into how these different meters work. Later in this tutorial, I do talk more about RMS and peak and compare and contrast them. But if you're interested in other modes of metering, you can definitely look that up if you're interested. And now finally, we have our Vectorscope settings. And we have our update knob, which, works pretty much the same way as the other update knobs. It just changes how the view updates on the wave candy. And then you also have a thickness knob. And this just changes the thickness of the points plotted on the Vectorscope. And you have a few different modes. This is more aesthetic. You can change how the points are displayed. And then finally, you have this add option, which turns on or off additive blending. So that is the Wave Candy plugin in FL Studio. Hopefully that was helpful. Hopefully you now have an idea of how you can use it to visually monitor your sound in a few different ways. And like I said before, if you're not sure how to read a vectorscope or a spectrum or an oscilloscope, in later videos in this tutorial I will go into more depth about all that. So definitely stay tuned for those.